Welcome. My name is Roger Berkowitz, and I'm the founder and academic director of the Hannah Arendt Center at Bard College. Today, we are beginning to read in our virtual reading group Hannah Arendt's book on revolution. This is one of my absolute favorite texts of Arendt. It's her last completed book that she completed in 1963, same year actually that she completed Eichmann in Jerusalem. And it's the book that she was working on for 5 years or so in the wake of the publishing of The Human Condition. And so it's in many ways the last great work she wrote on politics and her thinking about politics. It's also a book about America. The book is structured as an inquiry into both the American and French revolutions as two particular examples and models of a revolution. And she thinks that all of the revolutions that come after the American and French revolutions are modeled on them, primarily modeled on the French model. And she thinks that that is too bad because she is going to argue in this book that the American Revolution, not the French Revolution, is the one that succeeded in establishing a new democratic political order. And that is going to be one of the historical arguments of the book. And so we're going to learn a fair bit about the American Revolution, the American Constitution, and why Arendt thinks that the American constitutional revolution succeeded in establishing freedom in the United States, at least for a period. And the last chapter, which is titled The Lost Treasure of the American Revolution, is going to explain why she thinks that that great achievement of the American Revolution is either in danger of being lost or has been lost, depending on how we read it. But it certainly seems as if much of what was accomplished in the American Revolution, she thinks, has been lost post-World War II in the United States. And so we're going to have to engage with that history of the American Republic, as well as the political thinking, philosophy underlining it. I'm going to be working on with my colleague Thomas Meyer in Germany a new critical edition of this text over the next couple of years. And so this is I'm teaching it a lot these days, and this is an opportunity for me to share that with you. Today we're beginning with the first chapter or the prologue to the book, which is titled War and Revolution. And it's very short and deceptively simple. And yet a lot of the main themes of the book are presaged in this short introduction. It begins with this famous invocation of Lenin and the idea that wars and revolutions are, as Lenin predicted, the central political issues of the 20th century. It's still the case. Today, we have recently seen the Arab Spring, and even in something like the 2016 American election, on both the Trump side and the Sanders side, right? There was a lot of speaking of the need for a revolution. Why is it that we speak so easily of revolutions today? Why is it that revolutions, whether it's the post-Soviet Velvet revolutions in Prague or the Arab Spring revolutions or the idea of Bernie Sanders' political revolution, why is it that revolution is such a timely idea in our world? And that's part of the argument of this book, is that revolutions are incredibly timely, are part of our modern contemporary political scene, and that there's a reason they are. And the reason is very simple, that above all, what revolutions are about is freedom. They are, in the end, and we'll be talking about this certainly in the next session and throughout the course, revolutions are about the establishment of political freedom. That's what they seek. All revolutions are about freedom. And so on page 1, Arendt writes, wars and revolutions have outlived all their ideological justifications. In a constellation that poses the threat of total annihilation through war, against the hope for the emancipation of all mankind through revolution, no cause is left but the most ancient of all, the one in fact that from the beginning of our history has determined the very existence of politics, the cause of freedom versus tyranny. So there's a lot in this quote here on page 1. The first is that wars and revolutions have outlived their ideological justifications. Part of this is simply that the technology of violence that we have today is so extraordinary. I mean, nuclear and chemical weapons, but simply the destructiveness of conventional bombs and grenades and machine guns. But even more than that, the very idea of how war is fought today, which is to eradicate the distinction between military and civilian, that part of winning a war, at least if it's a real war, an all-out war, is undermining the supply lines, starving your opponent out, and thus what we call, following Ernst Junger, total war. And in such a total war where defeat means an existential question, that the country will no longer exist in its previous form, to fight a war for a religion or communism or such is increasingly impossible, because how are you going to justify the existential loss of all the lives or of the entire country simply for some ideology? And so it's hard to justify war and revolution in this context of total annihilation. And the one cause left that can justify death and annihilation is freedom. The old give me liberty or give me death. Now, Arendt will argue in another essay on freedom that this is, in a sense, an absurd claim, that very few people would rightly argue for liberty over death. But she does think, nevertheless, that is the way the way it has emerged, that the only way to justify wars today and revolutions is through the idea of freedom. And she says this is particularly strange because freedom is increasingly under assault in our contemporary world. And this is for a number of reasons, and she gives 3. The first is the rise of the social sciences. And this is a topic I know those of you who've been in previous sessions of ours I've heard a lot about. Hannah Arendt is someone who very much worries about the impact of the social sciences on our world. And one thing the social sciences do is it treats human beings, mankind, as a being that can be understood through predictable behavioral norms. And in doing so, it debunks the idea of human freedom, because there's a bell curve, and since all men, in some sense, fit on the bell curve, what we do is always within the bounds of normal predictive behavior, and thus it's hard to imagine it being free. once we internalize that social science perspective. And so social science actually um, works against the idea that there is such a thing as human freedom. Um, another another sort of way she expresses this is that freedom is really a lower middle class prejudice. It's something that we think that some people believe in, but we know because we're smarter and more socialized and intellectuals that there's causes behind everything, and that there's not much actual freedom in the world. And then finally, and this is related again to social science, what she calls the law of large numbers. That as we move from smaller societies to ever larger and more complex societies with large number of people in them, the ability of one person to act in such a way, to freely and spontaneously act in such a way that their action matters and changes the course of the society or the world, diminishes because it's harder for someone to impact a large community. And so the law of large numbers reduces the impact of human freedom. Um, and so on page 4, she writes, freedom has appeared in this debate. Freedom in the debate around justifying war, primarily, or revolution. She says, freedom has appeared in this debate like a deus ex machina to justify what on rational grounds has become unjustifiable. So the argument here is very clear. Rationally, war is unjustifiable. Who would go to war to protect economic rights when war might mean destruction? Who would go to war for to expand your boundaries or your borders when war might mean utter destruction? And so freedom sort of comes in as the sort of last justification for war, the deus ex machina, the God outside the machine that is brought in to make an argument that is otherwise unwinnable. She, again, this is a short first chapter, so I'm going to bring in one or two quotes from an essay she wrote a couple years after the book was published, which has been unpublished till now, but is about to be published in Thinking Without Banisters, a new essay collection edited by Jerome Cohn. And in this essay, she writes, quote, liberties in the sense of civil rights are the results of liberation, but they are by no means the actual content of freedom, whose essence is admission to the public realm and participation in public affairs. Had the revolutions aimed only at the guarantee of civil rights, liberation from regimes that had overstepped their power and infringed upon well-established rights would have been enough. The point of the matter is that liberation from oppression could very well have been fulfilled under monarchical, though not tyrannical government, whereas the freedom of a political way of life required a new, or rather rediscovered, form of government. So this is important, and I'm bringing this in because we're going to be talking a lot about freedom, as I mentioned before, and its connection to revolution. And here is part of her attempt to say what freedom means in her lexicon. Freedom is not simply liberty. Liberty, in the sense of civil rights, is a kind of liberation. It's freedom from a tyrant, freedom from a king. So the Arab Spring liberated some of these countries from tyrants, but that doesn't mean it instituted a free government. The United States at first liberated itself from England, but that doesn't mean that it was free. She argues that it only becomes free, establishes freedom later, once the revolution succeeds in establishing freedom. And what is it to establish freedom? It means the essence of it is admission to the public realm and participation in public affairs. It means that you have the freedom to act and speak in public, in a public realm, in a way that people will listen to you, in a way that you will matter. Freedom means to matter. It means that everyone, the poorest, whatever race, whatever religion you are, has the capacity to speak and act in a way that matter. And to go back to our discussion of the origins of totalitarianism in chapter 9, where she talks about the only human right, the right to have rights, is the right, she says, to be part of a political community and to speak and act in public in ways that matter. And that very much is her understanding of what it means to be human, and that's what it means to be free. To be free is to act, but to act in a way that matters in a public way. And this means for her something very important, which is that this new notion of freedom is not about social justice. It's about being visible. And so the key to freedom is not that you become equal in a kind of economic sense. It's not Marxist or capitalist. It's about being liberated from the kind of misery or servitude or slavery that would deny you a public voice, a chance to be meaningful. And so she's going to argue that slavery is the great sin of the American Revolution, because what it did is it deprived an entire group of people, the Black Americans, from a public voice, from visibility, and it in a revolution that was about founding freedom and thus giving everybody visibility, it excluded an entire group of people, and one of the challenges of the American republic post the revolution is to make up for that sin, and that's part of what she's and the failures to do that are part of what she's grappling with in this book. At the end of this introduction, or near the end of it, she then enters back into this question of war, and she says, well, if war is so unjustifiable, might war disappear? And she raises this, and this may seem sort of ridiculously ill-timed, time when we've been suffering through many wars. But what she means by it is that not that all fighting or violence will disappear, but non-revolutionary wars and wars simply fought for a kind of geopolitical advantage or for some other justification would disappear. Because on the one hand, they're so destructive that you can't really justify them anymore. And that in the end, we may think that actual war will be replaced by virtual war because, we'll be able to know who's going to win based on simulations and games, and that it may be that virtual war and deterring war is what military preparations are for, more so than actual fighting war. Whether this happens or not is still up for grabs, but it's an interesting thought. She then says on page 7 to 8, quote, "It has become almost a matter of course that the end of war is revolution, and that the only cause which possibly could justify it is the revolutionary cause of freedom." So this is to come back. The end of war is a double meaning, right? On the one hand, the end of war. Wars will end and cease because they will bleed into revolution. On the other hand, the goal of war is freedom, and therefore wars will all be revolutionary wars. Even the most basic and banal wars will be offered in the justification of freedom, because that's the only thing that can justify them. The last part of this short chapter is on violence, and she says that war and revolution are both violent. That's something that connects them, and that violence, however, is marginal to politics. And this is another part of her work that's addressed elsewhere, and also will be addressed later in this book. And she then brings up this idea of the state of nature, and the state of nature is interesting for her because even though it's a fiction and it's no one actually thought it was real, it's an imagination of a non-political realm, right? It's the realm, state of nature, before politics. And she says, in this non-political realm, what is imagined is a way of being together before politics that's not political. And so she says on page 10, the relevance of the state of nature, even today, lies in the recognition that a political realm does not automatically come into being wherever men live together, and that there exists events which, though they may occur in a strictly historical context, are not really political, and perhaps not even connected with politics. The notion of a state of nature alludes at least to a reality that cannot be comprehended by the 19th century idea of development, no matter how we may conceive of it, whether in the form of cause and effect, or of potentially an actuality, or of a dialectical movement, or even of simple coherence and sequence in occurrences. For the hypothesis of a state of nature implies the existence of a beginning that is separated from everything following it as though by an unbridgeable chasm. And this is important. She's going to begin the next section, the next chapter, referring back to this metaphor of the state of nature as an unbridgeable chasm, as a new beginning. And so the idea is that Hobbes and Rousseau and Kant and Locke and all these classic liberal thinkers imagine the beginning of political society coming out of a chasm of a new beginning, and it's one that's violent. The beginning is violent. She says, "In the beginning is violence." On page 9 to 10, she says, "Whatever brotherhood human beings may be capable of has grown out of fratricide. Whatever political organization men may have achieved has its origin in crime." Non-political, violent, outside. And it's this beginning, the attempt to start a new political order that is a break, is going to be absolutely essential to her idea of revolutions. And so on page 11, which is the first page of the first chapter, she says, quote, "Revolutions are the only political events which confront us directly and inevitably with the problem of beginning." And that's what we're going to try and understand and struggle with, how we begin something new which will found a political world of freedom. And that's going to be our struggle. So I hope this was a helpful beginning. Look forward to discussing this short chapter with you, and we will continue reading on revolution. Enjoy reading Hannah Arendt. Thank you very much.